I never imagined that someday I'd be sitting in the cockpit of the world's largest operational cargo aircraft, looking through the side window at another giant of the skies parked just 50 meters away. It was a Tuesday in October in Toulouse, France, and there they were. The majestic Antonov An-124 Ruslan I had just landed, and the peculiar Airbus Beluga A300-600 ST I would pilot the next day. Two aviation monsters that looked like something out of a science fiction movie, but would soon become the protagonists of the most complex and secret mission of my career. My name is Mike Richardson. I'm 47 years old, and for over 2 decades, I've been piloting cargo aircraft around the world. I've flown pretty much everything that carries weight, from small Cessna Caravans to Boeing 747 freighters, but I had never imagined I'd have the opportunity to command the two most extraordinary aircraft in commercial aviation in the same week. Much less that this experience would put me at the center of an operation that would define the future of space exploration. It all started 3 months earlier, when I received an unexpected call at my apartment in Houston, Texas. On the other end of the line, a female voice introduced herself as Sarah Mitchell, NASA's logistics coordinator. She got straight to the point. They needed an experienced American pilot in heavy aircraft for an ultra-confidential mission involving the transport of James Webb Space Telescope components. The project was already years behind schedule, and every day of delay cost millions of dollars. "Captain Mike, your credentials are impressive," Sarah said, while I was still trying to process the reality of that call. 23 years of experience, over 15,000 flight hours, certification for Antonov An-124, An-225, Boeing 747, Airbus A300, and an impeccable reputation. Exactly what we need. The mission, she explained, would involve transporting super-sensitive mirrors and ultra-high precision scientific equipment between 3 points: Toulouse, France, where the Airbus facility was located, Baikonur, Kazakhstan, where some special components were being finalized, and finally Kourou, French Guiana, from where the telescope would be launched into space. The challenge was that each leg required a specific type of aircraft due to the unique characteristics of the cargo and runways. The first leg, from Toulouse to Baikonur, has to be done in the Antonov An-124, Sarah continued. The telescope's main mirrors are enormous, weighing over 6 tons each, and they need a cargo compartment with the exact dimensions that only the Antonov can provide. The return trip from Baikonur to Toulouse and then to Kourou will be in the Beluga, because some components have such irregular shapes that they only fit in the super-wide fuselage of the A300-600 ST. When I hung up the phone, my head was spinning. Piloting an Antonov was already any cargo pilot's dream. Those Ukrainian aircraft were legendary, true giants of the skies capable of carrying practically anything. But the Beluga was another level of uniqueness. With that inflated fuselage that really looked like a whale, it was one of the strangest and most fascinating aircraft ever built, used exclusively by Airbus to transport aircraft parts between their factories. 3 weeks later, I was in Kiev, Ukraine, doing my recertification training on the Antonov An-124. Antonov Airlines, the only company in the world that operates these giants commercially, had an impressive base at Gostomel Airport. When I saw the Ruslan for the first time in the hangar, I stood in silence for several minutes. At 69 meters long and 73 meters wingspan, that machine was simply awesome. Its 4 Progress D18T engines roared with over 200,000 pounds of thrust, enough force to lift practically anything that would fit in its cargo hold. "It's different from anything you've ever piloted," said Viktor Petrov, the Ukrainian instructor who would accompany me during training. At 52, Viktor had over 15,000 hours just in Antonovs and knew those aircraft like no one else. The Ruslan isn't just big, it's smart. It has navigation and stabilization systems that automatically compensate for cargo shifts during flight. When you're carrying 100 tons of equipment, any movement can drastically affect the center of gravity. During 5 intense days, I learned every detail of that extraordinary machine. The loading system was an engineering masterpiece. The complete fuselage opened both at the rear and front, allowing enormous loads to be inserted directly by cranes. The hydraulic systems could lower the aircraft on its main wheels, facilitating loading. And the cockpit, despite looking outdated compared to modern glass cockpits, had its own logic that made total sense when you understood the Soviet design philosophy. "Remember," Victor said during my last training flight, while I practiced landings with maximum load, "the Antonov was designed to operate in conditions that would make other aircraft give up. Dirt runways, improvised airports, extreme weather. It was built to be practically indestructible, but that means you have to respect it. Don't try to be smarter than the engineers who designed it." 2 weeks later, I was in Toulouse for my Beluga training. If the Antonov impressed me with brute force, the Beluga fascinated me with creative engineering. When I saw that inflated fuselage for the first time, I couldn't help but smile. It really looked like a giant whale with wings. "It's the weirdest aircraft you'll pilot in your life," said Jean-Claude Dubois, my French instructor at Airbus. "Externally, it looks like an engineering joke, but it's one of the most sophisticated machines we've ever built. The fuselage was completely redesigned to maximize cargo volume, not weight. In here you can carry entire aircraft parts, complete A380 wings, A350 fuselage sections, things that simply wouldn't fit in any other aircraft in the world." The Beluga A300-600 ST was based on the Airbus A300, but modified so radically that it seemed like a completely different aircraft. The original fuselage was cut and expanded, creating a cargo compartment 7.4 meters wide and 7.7 meters high. Absolutely unique dimensions in commercial aviation. To compensate for the center of gravity change caused by the inflated fuselage, engineers had to move the cockpit downward, creating that distinctive smiling dolphin appearance when viewed from the front. "The most interesting part," Jean-Claude continued as I familiarized myself with the controls, "is that this aircraft defies all conventional rules of aerodynamics. Theoretically, it shouldn't fly. The inflated fuselage creates enormous air resistance, and the shape is completely unconventional. But it works, and works very well because every detail was calculated and recalculated thousands of times by our best engineers. During my training, I learned that piloting a Beluga was a unique experience. The controls responded differently due to the modified center of gravity, and the visibility from the low cockpit required complete adaptation of landing and takeoff techniques. But the most impressive thing was the flight stability. Despite the strange appearance, the aircraft flew with surprising smoothness, even fully loaded. Finally, mission day arrived. It was a grey Monday in October when I arrived at Toulouse Airport at 5 in the morning. The loading operation was already underway, and what I saw left me speechless. Dozens of technicians from NASA, ESA, European Space Agency, and Airbus worked in absolute silence around gigantic metal boxes containing the main mirrors of the James Webb Telescope. Each of these mirrors cost over $50 million to manufacture, explained Dr. Amanda Foster, the mission's chief scientist, as we supervised the loading into the Antonov. They're made of gold-plated beryllium, polished to atomic precision. A single scratch, excessive vibration, any impact, and years of work go down the drain. The responsibility was overwhelming. I wasn't just transporting valuable cargo, I was carrying the future of modern astronomy. The James Webb was the successor to the Hubble telescope, designed to observe the first galaxies formed after the Big Bang. If something went wrong during transport, it wouldn't just be a financial loss, but a years-long delay in our understanding of the universe. The loading procedure in the Antonov was millimeter-precise choreography. Each mirror was positioned in special cradles with pneumatic dampers that completely isolated any vibration. Motion sensors were installed at strategic points to constantly monitor any displacement during flight. The total cargo weight was 89 tons, well within the Ruslan's capacity, but still significant enough to affect all flight characteristics. "Captain Mike," said Victor, who had come specially from Kiev to accompany this mission, "you're going to feel the aircraft differently with this load, not just because of the weight, but because of the distribution. These mirrors are very dense and positioned in the center of the compartment. This will make the aircraft more stable, but also less responsive to commands. Anticipate all maneuvers." At 2:30 p.m., we finally received takeoff clearance. As I executed the pre-flight procedures, my mind went over every detail of the flight plan. Toulouse to Baikonur was approximately 4,500 kilometers, flying over the Alps, crossing Eastern Europe and entering the vast Kazakh territory. The estimated time was 5 hours and 40 minutes, with favorable winds for most of the route. Toulouse Tower. Antonov 247 Alpha November requesting taxi for departure runway 05. I transmitted for the first time at the controls of that giant. Antonov 247 Alpha November, taxi to runway 05 via taxiway Charlie. Wind 060 at 8 knots, QNH 1015. The taxi was a unique experience. The Antonov moved with majestic dignity, every movement calculated and deliberate. Through the side windows I could see technicians and onlookers standing to watch that extraordinary machine pass by. Even in Toulouse, an airport accustomed to large aircraft, the Antonov drew attention. At the runway threshold I executed the final checks. Victor was in the co-pilot seat, but this was my mission. I would be the pilot in command of that flying treasure. Toulouse Tower. Antonov 247 Alpha November ready for departure. Antonov 247 Alpha November, cleared for takeoff runway 05, contact departure 124.75. I pushed the 4 Progress D-18T engine throttles to takeoff position. The roar was deafening, even inside the acoustically isolated cockpit. With 89 tons of precious cargo, the takeoff roll was longer than normal, but the Antonov accelerated with relentless determination. At 180 knots, I gently pulled back on the yoke and felt that gigantic mass leave the ground with impressive smoothness. "Gear up," I announced, and Victor activated the landing gear. Toulouse departure, Antonov 247 Alpha November passing 3,000 feet. Climbing to flight level 390. Antonov 247 Alpha November, radar contact, climb and maintain flight level 390, track heading 090 to intercept airway Upper November 859. During the climb, I watched fascinated as the Antonov behaved. Even loaded with almost 90 tons, it climbed with absolute stability. The automatic compensation systems worked perfectly, keeping the aircraft in perfect balance, regardless of the light turbulence we encountered over the Alps. "How are you feeling?" Victor asked as we crossed over Switzerland at 39,000 feet. "It's incredible," I replied honestly. "It flies like it has no cargo at all. I can feel the weight, but the stability is unbelievable." "That's the magic of Antonov engineers," Victor smiled. "They knew this aircraft would carry precious and irregular loads, so they designed all systems to automatically compensate for any imbalance. It's almost impossible to throw an Antonov off balance." The first 3 hours of flight passed without problems. We crossed Austria, Hungary, Romania, and entered Ukrainian airspace. It was an emotional experience flying over the homeland of that magnificent aircraft. Below us, I could imagine the factories where visionary engineers created that extraordinary machine. But it was over Russia that things started getting interesting. At 6:45 p.m. local time, I was talking with Moscow Control when Victor drew my attention to the navigation instruments. "Mike, look at this," he said, pointing to the primary GPS. "We're losing signal precision." Initially, I wasn't worried. GPS interference was common in certain regions, especially over military territories. But when the secondary GPS also started oscillating, and then the third backup system, I realized we were facing something more serious. Moscow Control. Antonov 247 Alpha November experiencing GPS signal degradation. Request heading vectors to destination. Antonov 247 Alpha November, roger. We are receiving reports of GPS anomalies from multiple aircraft. Maintain heading 130. We are working on the issue. Victor was consulting the emergency manuals. "It could be a solar magnetic storm," he said, with a worried expression. "I've seen this a few times. Solar particles interfere with satellite signals, and it can last for hours." The situation was getting complicated quickly. Not only were our GPS navigation systems failing, but long-distance communications also began showing interference. The HF radio, which we used for intercontinental communications, was producing only static. Moscow Control, Antonov 247 Alpha November. We're also experiencing HF radio problems. How copy? Antonov 247 Alpha November. Barely readable. Try VHF. 121.5. Communications were deteriorating rapidly. Victor was using the inertial navigation system as backup, but those systems, while reliable, accumulated small errors over long flights. With still 2 hours to Baikonur, the margin of error could become significant. "What's the standard protocol for this situation?" I asked Victor, trying to keep my voice calm. "Normally we'd follow celestial navigation combined with dead reckoning," he replied. "But at night and with cloud cover it gets complicated. Our best option is to trust the INS and make course corrections whenever we can get contact with air traffic control." That's when I remembered a peculiarity of the Antonov that Victor had mentioned during training. Those aircraft had been designed during the Cold War, when electronic interference was a constant concern. They had redundant navigation systems designed specifically to operate in electronic warfare environments. "Victor, don't you guys have an astronomical navigation system on the Antonov?" His eyes lit up. "Of course, the ANS-9, Astronomical Navigation System. I almost forgot it's installed on this aircraft. It hasn't been used in years, but it should work." We spent the next 20 minutes activating and calibrating a system that hadn't been used since the 1990s. The ANS-9 used observations of stars and planets to determine our position, completely independent of satellite signals or radio communications. It was archaic technology by modern standards, but functional. "System calibrated," Victor announced after a series of manual calculations. "According to the ANS-9, we're about 12 kilometers north of the planned route, but with correct heading for Baikonur." I made a small course correction and continued flying in the dark, literally and figuratively. The northern lights were visible to the north, a visual reminder of the magnetic storm causing our problems. It was an impressive natural spectacle, but also the cause of our complicated situation. At 8:15 p.m., we managed to establish weak contact with Baikonur control. Baikonur approach, Antonov 247 Alpha November, approximately 40 minutes out. GPS and communications compromised. Request vectors for approach. Novi 247, radar contact. 38 miles southeast, cleared direct, runway 23, winds light, variable. The approach to Baikonur would be challenging. Without precise GPS, we depended entirely on air traffic control vectors and visual navigation. Fortunately, Baikonur Airport had ILS instrument landing system, approach systems that worked independently of GPS satellites. "Gear down, flaps 20, I commanded, as we aligned with runway 23. "Gear down, flaps 20, Victor confirmed. The Antonov, even heavy with its precious cargo, responded precisely to commands. The approach was stable and controlled, and the touchdown was smooth as silk. Those $50 million mirrors didn't even feel the landing. Baikonur Tower, Antonov 247 Alpha November runway vacated. Taxi to parking area Alpha. When I finally shut down the engines on the Baikonur ramp, I felt a mixture of relief and satisfaction. We had overcome a complex situation using a combination of modern technology and archaic systems, proving that redundancy and experience were still fundamental in aviation. Dr. Amanda Foster was waiting on the ramp when we opened the cargo compartment. "How was the flight, Captain?" "Educational," I replied with a smile. "Your mirrors are in perfect condition." The post-flight inspection confirmed that the cargo was absolutely intact. The vibration isolation systems had worked perfectly, and not even the improvised navigation had affected flight stability. 3 days later, it was time for the second part of the mission, transporting the integrated components back to Toulouse in the Beluga and then to Kourou. During those 3 days in Baikonur, the James Webb mirrors were integrated with other ultra-sensitive electronic systems, creating an even more delicate cargo with completely irregular shape. "This part will be even more challenging," Jean-Claude explained when he arrived at Baikonur to accompany the loading in the Beluga. "The integrated components have very irregular shape and displaced center of gravity. Plus, some electronic systems are sensitive to electromagnetic fields, so we'll have to avoid certain routes over military installations." The loading in the Beluga was a spectacle apart. That inflated fuselage really allowed carrying things that wouldn't fit in any other aircraft. Technicians used special cranes to position the components inside the cavernous compartment, where they were secured with dampening systems even more sophisticated than in the Antonov. The advantage of the Beluga, Jean-Claude explained as we supervised the procedure, is that the fuselage was designed specifically for irregular loads. The securing system allows accommodating practically any shape, and the flight controls automatically compensate for changes in center of gravity. At 11:30 a.m. the next morning, we were ready for takeoff from Baikonur. The magnetic storm had passed, and all navigation systems were working normally. But the Beluga presented its own unique challenges. Baikonur Tower, Beluga 57 Alpha Foxtrot Charlie requesting taxi for departure runway 23. Beluga 57 Alpha Foxtrot Charlie, taxi to runway 23 via taxiway Delta, wind 270 at 12 knots, QNH 1028. Taxiing in the Beluga was a completely different experience from the Antonov. The low cockpit offered a unique perspective, almost like driving a big truck, and the response to controls was notably different, more sensitive, more agile, despite the size. Ready for takeoff, I transmitted to the tower. Beluga 57 Alpha Foxtrot Charlie, cleared for takeoff runway 23. Contact departure 125.8. The takeoff in the Beluga was surprisingly smooth. Despite the inflated fuselage and unconventional shape, the aircraft left the ground with impressive naturalness. The most notable difference was the aerodynamic noise, significantly higher than conventional aircraft due to the modified fuselage. "Incredible, isn't it?" said Jean-Claude during the climb. "Every time I fly this machine, I'm amazed that it actually works." During the flight back to Toulouse, I had time to really appreciate the differences between the two giants I had piloted. The Antonov was pure brute force, a machine designed to carry anything anywhere, regardless of conditions. The Beluga was creative engineering, a specific solution for a specific problem, but executed with surprising elegance. "You know," said Jean-Claude as we crossed over the Caspian Sea, "you're one of the few pilots in the world who can say they commanded both an Antonov and a Beluga in the same week. They're completely different philosophies of aeronautical engineering." It was true. While the Antonov represented the Soviet approach, robust, redundant, capable of operating in extreme conditions, the Beluga represented the European approach, innovative, optimized, focused on efficiency for specific tasks. Both were extraordinary, but for completely different reasons. The return flight to Toulouse passed without problems, and when we landed 4 hours later, a new NASA team was waiting for the final stage, transport to Kourou, French Guiana. "Captain Mike," said Dr. Foster as we supervised preparation for the last leg, "I want you to know that this operation was exceptional. Transporting such sensitive equipment in two such different aircraft, facing magnetic interference, and still maintaining all vibration and stability specifications within parameters. That's what separates good pilots from extraordinary pilots." 3 hours later, we were taking off from Toulouse for the last time, bound for Kourou. This would be the shortest leg, but no less important. In Kourou, the James Webb components would be integrated with the Ariane 5 rocket that would take them to space. The flight over the Atlantic was calm and meditative. Looking down at the infinite ocean, I reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past few days. I had commanded two of the most remarkable machines ever built by man, transporting equipment that would expand our understanding of the universe. Kourou approach. Beluga 57 Alpha Foxtrot Charlie with you at 15,000. Requesting vectors for approach runway 09. Beluga 57 Alpha Foxtrot Charlie. Radar contact, descend and maintain 5,000. Vectors for ILS approach runway 09, wind 070 at 10 knots. The landing at Kourou was perfect. When I finally shut down the Beluga engines and opened the cargo compartment, I knew I had participated in something historic. Those components I had transported so carefully between 3 continents would soon be in space, capturing images of the first galaxies formed after the Big Bang. Dr. Foster met me on the ramp after the technicians finished unloading. "Captain, on behalf of NASA, ESA, and the entire global scientific community, thank you. You didn't just transport equipment, you helped make the future of astronomy possible." 3 months later, I was watching the James Webb launch from the Kourou Space Center on television. When the Ariane 5 rocket disappeared into the clouds carrying those mirrors I had transported so carefully, I felt indescribable pride. Not many pilots can say they helped put a telescope in space. Today, whenever I see images captured by the James Webb, distant galaxies, colorful nebulae, planets in far-off solar systems, I remember those 2 extraordinary days flying the giants of the skies. The powerful Antonov An-124, with its brute force and unshakable reliability, and the peculiar Beluga A300-600 ST, with its creative engineering and unique capability. They were 2 completely different machines, created with opposite philosophies, but both representing the best of human aeronautical engineering, and for a few magical days, I had the privilege of commanding both, carrying the future of space exploration through the skies. Every time I look at the night sky now, I know that up there, more than 1.5 million kilometers from Earth, a telescope is working whose most sensitive components traveled with me across 3 continents. It's a feeling that no pilot ever forgets, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you're flying a small Cessna or a giant like the Antonov or Beluga. What really matters is the responsibility of safely carrying your cargo to its destination. Sometimes that cargo is people, sometimes it's commercial products, and sometimes, if you're really lucky, it's the instruments that help us understand our place in the universe. And when you have the chance to command machines as extraordinary as the Antonov and Beluga, every flight becomes a lesson in humility before human ingenuity. They're aircraft that defy conventional logic and prove that when we combine creativity, determination, and technical excellence, we can literally make the impossible fly. If you enjoyed this story about these giants of the skies, subscribe to Black Box so you don't miss the next tale from the heavens. Because up in the heights, every flight is an adventure, and every aircraft has its own personality, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to take the controls.